In November 1930, a fur trapper walked into a remote Arctic village to find every single resident gone, while hot food was still cooking over glowing campfire embers. Inside the tents, loaded rifles sat untouched against the walls and half-sewn winter coats rested with needles still stuck in the fur, yet -40-degree snow surrounded the settlement without a single footprint leading away. What the Royal Canadian Mounted Police uncovered beneath the frozen earth 3 days later turned an impossible disappearance into something far more terrifying. Joe LaBelle was no stranger to the brutal Canadian wilderness. He had spent decades navigating the frozen tundra of the Northwest Territories. He knew the bite of 40-below winds. He knew the unforgiving silence of the Arctic night. And he knew the small Inuit village on the icy shores of Lake Anjikuni. It was a reliable shelter for trappers. A close community of roughly 30 hunters and their families known for their warmth and hospitality. On the night of November 12, 1930, LaBelle was freezing and exhausted. The full moon cast a stark, bone-white glow across the snowdrifts. As his snowshoes crunched toward the settlement, he expected the usual welcome. He expected the frantic, protective barking of the village sled dogs. He expected the flicker of seal oil lamps against caribou skin tents. Instead, there was nothing. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping village. It was heavy. Suffocating. LaBelle stopped in his tracks. His hand drifted instinctively to his rifle. Something was dead wrong. He called out into the darkness. No response. Only the low howl of the Arctic wind. LaBelle stepped deeper into the camp. That was when he caught the scent. Not blood. Not decay. Smoke. Fresh, wood-fire smoke. He followed the trail toward the center of the village. There, resting over a bed of glowing coals, was a copper pot. Steam was still rising into the freezing air. LaBelle leaned over and looked inside. It was caribou stew. Freshly prepped. Scalding warm. The villagers hadn't left hours ago. They had been standing over this fire just minutes before he arrived. LaBelle shouted again. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The wind swallowed his voice. He approached the nearest dwelling, pulling back the heavy hide door flap. But what he found next made no sense. Inside, the living space was completely intact. On a wooden block lay a half-finished sealskin parka. A bone needle was still stuck in the soft fur, left mid-stitch as if the seamstress had simply looked up and dissolved into thin air. LaBelle rushed from tent to tent, shack to shack. The story was identical everywhere he looked. Utter normalcy, instantly frozen in time. But the strangest part was still to come. Leaning against the frame inside almost every doorway were the villagers' rifles. To an outsider, a left-behind weapon might seem minor. To an Arctic hunter in 1930, it was a death sentence. An Inuit hunter never walked 10 feet from his home without a rifle. Polar bears and timber wolves stalked these perimeter lines constantly. Leaving your primary weapon behind wasn't just reckless, it was unthinkable. It meant whatever caused these people to leave, they didn't intend to fight. And they didn't intend to run. Terror finally broke LaBelle's composure. He turned and ran. He pushed his body past the point of exhaustion through the blinding snow to the nearest telegraph outpost miles away. His hands shook so violently he could barely operate the key. He tapped out a frantic message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police: "A whole village has vanished. Send help immediately." 3 days later, a specialized unit of mounted police arrived at Lake Anjikuni alongside expert native trackers. The officers assumed there was a rational answer. A sudden evacuation. A rival tribe attack. A mass migration. The trackers began sweeping the perimeter. But as they inspected the ground, rational explanations crumbled. Fresh snow had fallen 2 days prior, covering the terrain. But beneath that light dust lay a thick layer of rock-hard, undisturbed crust. The police expanded their search grid to a 3-mile radius around the entire settlement. They found 0 footprints, 0 sled tracks, 0 drag marks. It was as if 25 men, women, and children had been lifted straight into the atmosphere. And what investigators discovered next would change everything. A constable walking near the lakefront noticed something strange protruding from a massive snowdrift. He called the team over. Digging through the crusted snow, they uncovered a brutal sight. 7 village sled dogs were tied to stunted spruce stumps. They were dead. Frozen solid. The medical assessment was unbelievable. The dogs had starved to death. Sled dogs were an Arctic family's most valuable asset, worth more than gold. Yet these dogs had been left tied up, starving to death just 50 feet away from tents stocked with piles of dried fish and caribou meat. If the villagers fled in a panic, why take the time to tie their dogs up? If they intended to return in 5 minutes, where did they go? The police officers were unnerved. But as they walked toward the crest of a nearby ridge, the mystery turned into pure nightmare fuel. On the high ground overlooking the lake stood the village burial site. For centuries, the Inuit buried their dead beneath massive mounds of heavy glacial rock to protect them from scavengers. The dirt beneath those rocks was frozen solid, permafrost as hard as steel. When the officers reached the cemetery, they stopped in absolute horror. Every single grave had been opened. Yet, the most shocking reveal was still to come. The massive boulders hadn't been scattered by hungry wild animals. They were neatly stacked into twin, uniform columns beside each open pit. The frozen corpses had been lifted from the earth and carried away into the dark. Animals don't stack heavy rocks into perfect pillars. And starving humans don't spend hours chiseling through rock-hard permafrost to steal dead ancestors when hot stew is sitting on the stove. The tools required to dig through that ice were still sitting inside the abandoned huts. The police officers were paralyzed. Nothing in their training explained what they were seeing. Then came the statements from neighboring regions. Trapper Armand Laurent and his sons, located miles south at Lake Parquois, reported something bizarre happening on the exact night the village vanished. They described a strange, luminous object gliding across the northern sky. It wasn't the northern lights. It was a massive, glowing cylinder that pulsed with a brilliant bluish light. Laurent watched as the object hovered motionless directly over Lake Anjikuni, before silently accelerating into space at an impossible speed. In the months following the incident, official Canadian police logs documented the investigation. But as years passed and public curiosity grew, the official stance shifted. Government archives began redacting files. Skeptics tried to claim the village never existed at all, a mere campfire legend. Yet original police logs from 1931 prove the investigation happened. The report remains open. No bodies were ever recovered. No tracks were ever found. Consider what happened on that frozen night in 1930. A peaceful community prepares dinner. A mother repairs a parka. Children sit by the warmth of the fire. In a single fraction of a second, something happens. They don't put on their heavy coats. They don't grab their rifles. They leave their dogs tied to the trees. They step out into -40-degree air. No blood is shed. No tracks are left in the snow. Their dead are unburied from the frozen earth, and an entire culture vanishes from the face of the planet. Did an unknown force descend from the sky to harvest the living and the dead alike? Or did something ancient wait beneath the Arctic ice? Tell me your theory in the comments below. And if you dare to explore the darkest mysteries of our world, hit subscribe to join Nocturne Files.